And Brad, I feel like the stress level throughout healthcare had increased dramatically during the pandemic, and I think this is what resulted in perhaps a lot of folks leaving the industry, or perhaps folks who are training to come into the industry maybe choosing another career option. But are you seeing increased levels of stress among your staff, and can you talk about any ways that you might be helping to deal with that?
Yeah, no, I mean, 100%. And I think, I made an allusion to, taking a phone call at, 11 in the evening to help somebody walk through an e-diary. I mean, that happens frequently. And, we are working, especially on trials where, the e-diary entry is whether or not they make it through to randomization. So you're sort of clawing and, you're doing everything you can to help support this patient, through, obviously not just screening, but throughout the whole trial. And it becomes very challenging to ask. It's very hard to ask my coordinator to pick up their phone at midnight, when a patient is calling because an e-diary is malfunctioning. And then, tie it all back to, we never even really got good training on the e-diary in the first place. So I can't even tell what they're looking at. And then pretty soon you've got, just frustrated staff. Stress is increasing, and it becomes, even more challenging to retain staff. So, I mean, again, it's just a small example, but one that we've seen, incredibly frequently.
And is that overtime if you're answering the phone at midnight?
Well, yeah, and again, that potentially comes back as a more cost to the side. If I'm going to incentivize my coordinator, then I've got to make sure that they're well taken care of for going that extra mile. So yeah, again, it just all starts to add up after a while.
And Carrie, are you seeing similar issues?
100% for sure. Wherever we can have a backup plan for when a system doesn't work, I think that alleviates a lot of stress or continued stress in a protocol. And like for instance, I've had great new nurses and old nurses that have been here, or coordinators that have been working that aren't really interested in the tech component. And so, I've had one just recently switch over to the diabetes education program within our institution because she just wanted patient care. So I think, again, this comes back to what I was saying earlier. You really have to think about hiring the right person for the right job and starting to split up the responsibilities based on what people enjoy in a job. And that's really going to help with retention in the long run. Who are also comfortable in using maybe technology versus not technology and finding the right role for that particular individual. It's just that you have to change that model. Otherwise, this is not sustainable.
And Carrie, I'm going to stick with you. One of our listeners said they believe a critical issue around DCTs and sites revolves around liability and the question of who is responsible for what, because all of a sudden we're doing trials in a very different way and incorporating a lot of things that perhaps we didn't do in the past with traditional trials. Can you share what you believe are some of the unanswered questions that maybe we still need to resolve around that issue?
Yeah, and again, I was just on a conversation earlier this week, a direct example. It's who is ultimately responsible, and is it truly the PI? And if it's a vendor that we have no control over, we haven't done the vendor audit because it was driven by the sponsor. We don't know the people that are doing the work. If there's an endpoint missed, who's responsible for the kappa in that So I think right now what I'm hearing is that the PI is wanting to shift that responsibility in that case to the sponsor. And then the sponsor contracts with the vendor to do that part of the protocol. So for sure, liability, especially when it's out of the institution's hands and control, both from a training, qualification, also, just vetting the compliance part of it, that is a big question right now. That is not clear. And again, it's protocol by protocol dependent. Indemnification, indemnifying, if there isn't the responsibility from the site perspective and it is a vendor, that indemnification does cover that risk that might ensue. These are, I would say right now, that's probably the one that has the least clarity. And I would say it's mostly what I'm seeing in a direct to patient kind of like something where there's adverse events being collected, like pretty prominent responsibilities. That's a big question for the sites.
And Brad Mitchell, who I'm guessing is with the site network as well, mentions, would a centralized tech support service benefit the site by relieving some of those late night phone calls? So I guess this would be something set up by a sponsor where if they're working on a trial with multiple sites, have one tech support service that all of those patients could call into if they have an issue. Would you see that possibly working to help with some of the issues you mentioned, or do you see other, I guess, challenges that could come up as a result of that?
Yeah, I mean, both, frankly. I mean, I think it could potentially relieve, or maybe even another idea I think would be if the site management organization sort of takes on that role, maybe they have their own internal, tech support, so to speak. But I mean, it raises its own problems potentially too, because I've also been on the phone with a patient going through an e-diary process, and you may learn of an AE or an SAE that you weren't aware of. So, I mean, how is that going to get communicated if it's they're dealing with the sponsor contact? Do they even know who to pass that down to? And I also think a big part of patient retention is that we do build those relationships with the patients. We don't want to say, "Not my problem, go call somebody else," and they don't like that. They will call you first, and in a lot of ways, although that can be burdensome and challenging for the site, I still think it's preferable to sort of outsourcing it, because I do think it helps strengthen that relationship, keeps patients engaged, and keeps them retained. So yeah, I mean, ultimately I think that's could go either way, but again, I feel like that could raise more questions.
I would say my optimal would be that escalation process. So that whoever is the vendor and or the sponsor, that someone is an expert that you can escalate it. Because routinely we start off with the monitor, and the monitors aren't the experts. And so that it's the trail and the time it takes to get to the answer. And so I think each of these companies have to deploy a group so that there's a line of communication from the site, because the patient will always call the site first, especially if you have that great relationship. So you can't just stop that motion. So that would be probably the best solution, to really invest in an escalation point that's competent, really, in answering the question and getting to a solution.